Picture this 13th century Europe, a place where distant lands were shrouded in myth and mystery, where whispers of faraway empires felt more like legends than reality. Then came Marco Polo, a Venetian merchant whose journey across the vast expanse of Asia shattered those illusions, replacing them with something even more extraordinary: truth. His travels weren't just about spices and silk. They were a window into civilizations so advanced, so meticulously organized, that his accounts read like prophecies. And here's the thing many of them were. Marco Polo didn't just describe the East, he predicted its future with uncanny accuracy, detailing innovations and cultural practices that would leave Europe in awe for centuries. What if I told you that one man's observations could rewrite an entire continent's understanding of the world? Marco Polo's predictions weren't guesses, they were insights gleaned from years immersed in the courts of Kublai Khan, walking the bustling streets of cities like Hangzhou, where technology and culture thrived in ways medieval Europe couldn't fathom. He wrote of paper money long before it reached the West, described coal as a burning, black stone when Europeans still relied on wood, and marveled at a postal system so efficient it put every European kingdom to shame. These weren't just passing notes, they were glimpses into a future that would eventually arrive on Europe's doorstep, proving Polo's vision was decades, even centuries, ahead of its time. But why does this matter to us today? Because Marco Polo's story isn't just about the past, it's about how curiosity and cross-cultural exchange can change the course of history. His predictions remind us that progress isn't born in isolation. It's sparked by the courage to explore, to listen, and to learn from civilizations beyond our own. So let's step into his world, retracing the footsteps of a man who saw tomorrow with startling clarity. From groundbreaking technologies to social systems that defied European expectations, we're about to uncover 20 of his most astonishingly accurate predictions, each one a testament to the power of looking beyond the horizon. Ready to see the East through Marco Polo's eyes, this journey begins now. Born into a family of Venetian merchants in 1254, Marco Polo grew up surrounded by stories of distant lands tales that would soon become his reality. By the age of 17, he joined his father and uncle on what would become one of the most epic journeys in history, a grueling 24-year expedition across the vast and uncharted territories of Asia. This wasn't just a trip for trade, it was an immersion into civilizations light years ahead of medieval Europe. When they reached the court of Kublai Khan, ruler of the Mongol Empire, Marco's sharp mind and adaptability caught the emperor's attention. He wasn't just a visitor, he became an official envoy, traveling deep into the heart of an empire that stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the gates of Europe. Imagine walking into a world where paper notes replaced heavy coins, where black stones dug from the earth burned hotter than wood, and where a single courier network could relay messages faster than any horse in Venice. These weren't just novelties to Marco Polo, they were clues to a future Europe hadn't yet dreamed of. His privileged position in Kublai Khan's administration gave him front-row access to innovations that would take centuries to reach the West. While European kings still ruled from drafty castles, Polo documented cities with paved streets, public granaries, and even a form of social welfare for the poor. His writings read like a blueprint for progress, one that Europe would spend generations catching up to. But here's what made Marco Polo truly extraordinary. He didn't just record what he saw, he recognized its potential. When he described the Khan's use of paper money, he wasn't merely noting an exotic custom. He was predicting a financial revolution, one that would eventually transform global trade. His accounts of coal weren't just travel anecdotes, They hinted at an energy source that would fuel the Industrial Revolution, and his awe at China's centralized bureaucracy. A foreshadowing of modern governance, Polo's genius lay in his ability to see the seeds of tomorrow in the world around him. So when we examine his first startling prediction, the rise of paper currency, we're not just looking at history. We're seeing the moment one man's curiosity bridged two worlds, turning observation into prophecy. Marco Polo stood in the bustling markets of Kublai, modern-day Beijing, watching as merchants exchanged not clinking coins but crisp, stamped paper. To European eyes, it must have seemed like magic. He wrote of imperial certificates adorned with the Khan's seal, ink replacing gold, a system so efficient it could fund empires. They make it from the bark of mulberry trees, he noted, describing how these notes held the same value as precious metal. While European traders lugged heavy chests of silver, China had unlocked the secret of lightweight wealth. Polo called it the philosopher's stone, not just for its alchemical symbolism, but because it transformed economic possibility. What stunned him most wasn't just the currency itself, but the foresight behind it. The Yuan dynasty didn't just print money, they engineered trust. Each note bore the Khan's threat of death to counterfeiters, a brutal guarantee of stability. The government controlled supply, banning private gold hoarding to ensure paper's dominance. Polo watched as this system funded infrastructure, armies, and trade networks spanning continents. Back in Venice, where bankers were still cutting coins in dark alleys, such centralized financial control was unimaginable. Yet Polo grasped its potential, writing, "All the peoples and populations under his rule willingly received these papers in payment." He saw what Europe wouldn't admit for centuries. Money wasn't about metal, it was about collective belief. The irony, when Polo's memoirs reached Europe, scholars scoffed. Paper as currency, a fairy tale. Yet by the 17th century, Stockholm's Banco del Monte pioneered Europe's first banknotes, and by the 19th, the world ran on paper. Polo's prediction wasn't just accurate, it was prescient. He'd witnessed the birth of fiat currency, where value derives from governance rather than material. Today, as digital transactions eclipse cash, his observations feel newly relevant. The philosopher's stone he described wasn't just mulberry bark and ink. It was the realization that economies thrive not on weight, but on innovation. And that might be his greatest legacy, proof that the future often hides in plain sight, waiting for the curious to take note. Marco Polo's description of the black stones burning in Chinese hearths might sound mundane today, but to 13th century Europeans, it was nothing short of revolutionary. He wrote of a mineral dug from the earth, black, brittle, and far more potent than firewood. These stones burn better than wood, he noted, and if you light them in the evening, they will still be a light in the morning. For a continent that relied on dwindling forests for warmth and industry, the idea of a rock that could outlast timber was met with disbelief, even mockery. Yet Polo wasn't exaggerating. In China, coal had been mined since the Han Dynasty, fueling everything from household stoves to massive iron foundries. While European blacksmiths struggled with uneven temperatures from wood fires, Chinese metalworkers achieved precision with coal's intense, steady heat, an advantage that shaped everything from weaponry to architecture. What fascinated Polo wasn't just the fuel itself, but the sophistication surrounding its use. He documented mines with ventilation shafts to prevent toxic gas buildup, and transport networks that moved coal efficiently to cities. In Europe, such large-scale extraction wouldn't emerge for another 500 years. Even more striking, the Khan's government regulated coal as a strategic resource. Stockpiling it for public projects, a foreshadowing of modern energy policies. Polo's account hinted at a truth Europe would later confront. Energy isn't just about fire, it's about power, both literal and geopolitical. When England's forests could no longer support its growing population in the 16th century, coal became the lifeline that saved its economy. By the Industrial Revolution, Britain's factories and steamships ran on the very black stones Polo had described centuries earlier, the real irony. While Europe initially dismissed his claims, they eventually embraced coal with such fervor that it remade the world. Polo's observations weren't just a travelogue footnote, they were a prophecy of industrialization. He'd witnessed a civilization that understood energy's role in progress long before the West caught up. Today, as we shift from fossil fuels to renewables, his writings remind us that every energy revolution begins with curiosity. The black stones he marveled at weren't just rocks, they were the spark of a future he alone seemed to foresee. The streets of Hangzhou stretched before Marco Polo like a masterclass in civilization, wide, paved, and meticulously organized, a stark contrast to the cramped, muddy lanes of medieval Venice. He described a city of 12,000 bridges where canals and avenues formed a perfect grid, guiding traffic with an efficiency Europe wouldn't achieve for centuries. But it wasn't just the layout that left him breathless, it was the hidden ingenuity beneath. The whole city is drained by underground channels, he wrote, marveling at sewers that carried waste away from homes, preventing the plagues that routinely ravaged European cities. While Londoners tossed garbage into the Thames and Parisians waded through filth, Hangzhou's engineers had crafted a subterranean network so advanced, it rivaled ancient Rome's. What truly set Eastern cities apart wasn't just infrastructure, it was foresight. Polo documented public hospitals staffed by government-paid physicians, free pharmacies for the poor, and even fire brigades equipped with pumps and organized patrols. In an era when European medicine relied on leeches and superstition, Hangzhou's hospitals practiced systematic diagnosis, separating patients by illness to prevent contagion. The city's granaries, stocked by imperial decree, ensured no one starved during famines. Polo noted how officials inspected markets daily, enforcing fair weights and prices, a level of bureaucratic oversight unthinkable in Europe's feudal chaos. These weren't just conveniences, they were the pillars of a society that viewed civic welfare as a science. Archaeologists centuries later would uncover the physical proof of Polo's accounts: ceramic pipes from advanced drainage systems, remnants of standardized brick roads, even traces of the public lamps that lit Hangzhou's nights. But beyond the engineering feats lies a deeper revelation. Polo glimpsed a philosophy, one where urban design wasn't about grandeur but harmony. While European kings built cathedrals to awe the masses, Eastern rulers invested in roads that connected, systems that sustained, and institutions that healed. The lesson Polo carried home wasn't just about bricks and canals. It was a radical idea that a city's greatness is measured not by its monuments, but by how it cares for the least of its people. And that, perhaps, was his most subversive prediction of all. The future belonged not to the mightiest conquerors, but to the wisest planners. Marco Polo unrolled the Chinese maps with the same reverence others might reserve for sacred texts. Here, drawn in meticulous ink, was the empire laid bare. Rivers snaked with hydrological accuracy, mountain ranges rose in precise proportion, and cities stood exactly where travelers would find them. To a man raised on European maps filled with sea monsters and the edges of the earth labeled, "Here be dragons," this was nothing short of revelatory. He wrote of maps so reliable that merchants could plot routes without guides, and imperial couriers traversed thousands of miles using nothing but these paper guides. What stunned Polo wasn't just the detail, but the philosophy behind it, geography as a tool of governance, not myth. the secret lay in methods Europe wouldn't adopt for centuries. Chinese cartographers used grid systems, plotting locations with a coordinate precision that predated latitude and longitude. Polo described instruments like the gnomon, a sun shadow measurer, and detailed land surveys conducted by teams of mathematicians. While European mapmakers sketched Jerusalem as the world's center based on religious dogma, the Yuan dynasty's mapmakers embraced empiricism, updating charts with data from sailors, Silk Road caravans, and even foreign diplomats. Polo noted how the Khan's officials cross-referenced these maps with tax records and census data, creating an administrative web as precise as the geography it documented. Consider the ripple effect of such accuracy. Polo witnessed harbor masters using tidal charts to time shipments, military strategists planning campaigns with terrain models, and architects aligning cities to celestial patterns. In contrast, Europe's best maps still placed the Garden of Eden in Armenia and depicted Africa as a distorted crescent. When Polo's accounts reached Venice, scholars debated whether such precision was even possible, until Portuguese explorers, centuries later, used stolen copies of Chinese charts to navigate the Indian Ocean. The maps Polo praised didn't just guide travelers, they hinted at a worldview where knowledge was cumulative, collaborative, and relentlessly practical. His prediction that the future belonged to those who mapped the world as it was, not as they wished it to be, and in that he was utterly right. Marco Polo ran his fingers across a bolt of silk so fine it flowed like water, a fabric Europeans would have paid a king's ransom for, yet here in Hangzhou, it draped the shoulders of merchants and maids alike. This wasn't just a luxury, it was an industry humming with the rhythm of looms in every district. He described mulberry groves stretching to the horizon, their leaves feeding the silkworms that spun threads finer than a spider's web. While European nobles fought over scraps of imported silk, Polo stood in warehouses stacked floor to ceiling with bolts dyed in colors no dyer in Venice could name. His notes peeled back the curtain on a process so guarded, China had executed anyone caught smuggling silkworms for centuries. The real revelation wasn't just the scale of production, but the innovation behind it. Polo documented hydraulic-powered looms that wove intricate patterns automatically, a mechanical marvel centuries before Europe's Industrial Revolution. He marveled at dyeing techniques using minerals and plants unknown in the West, creating hues that resisted fading even after years of wear, most startling. The Chinese had standardized silk quality, with imperial inspectors stamping grades onto each roll, a system of mass production and quality control that wouldn't reach Europe until the 1800s. Polo's accounts read like an industrial espionage report, detailed descriptions of worm-rearing chambers kept at precise temperatures, of women's hands moving so fast they seemed to have 6 fingers, of trade networks that moved raw silk from farm to workshop to port with breathtaking efficiency. When Polo's writings finally reached Genoa, they sparked a frenzy. Italian merchants, tired of paying China's exorbitant prices, pored over his descriptions of mulberry cultivation. Byzantine weavers studied his notes on loom designs, adapting them for European workshops. Yet for all their efforts, Europe couldn't replicate China's silk mastery overnight because Polo had uncovered a deeper truth. Silk wasn't just a product, it was an ecosystem. From the farmers who timed harvests to the silkworm's life cycle, to the artisans who spun threads under strictly controlled humidity, every step relied on knowledge accumulated over millennia. The lesson hidden in Polo's pages was clear. True innovation isn't stolen, it's cultivated. And that might explain why, even as Europe scrambled to catch up, Chinese silk remained the gold standard for centuries, proof that some secrets aren't in the technique, but in the patience to perfect it. The night sky over Hangzhou erupted in a spectacle Marco Polo could only describe as flowers of fire and thunder. What began as brilliant bursts of color soon gave way to something far more unsettling: explosions that shook the ground beneath his feet. These weren't just celebratory fireworks, they were demonstrations of a force Europe wouldn't harness for centuries: gunpowder. Polo's journals detailed the precise mixtures of saltpeter, sulfur, and charcoal that Chinese alchemists had perfected, noting how these powders could burst through iron when confined. Yet his most chilling observation came during a military parade, where bamboo tubes packed with the substance launched projectiles with devastating force. "The noise is heard at a distance of 10 miles, he wrote, terrifying both men and horses. To Polo, these displays were curiosities. To history, they were a prophecy of warfare's bloody future. Why did Europe dismiss these warnings for so long? Partly because Polo himself underestimated them. He framed gunpowder as entertainment, emphasizing its use in festivals over its battlefield potential. But the deeper truth lay in cultural blind spots. Medieval knights, armored and mounted, couldn't fathom a world where their dominance might be shattered by peasant-born chemists wielding tubes of powder. Chinese strategists, meanwhile, had already integrated gunpowder into siege warfare, using primitive fire lances to breach city walls as early as the 10th century. Polo's accounts even hinted at early grenade ceramic shells filled with shrapnel and gunpowder tossed into enemy ranks. Yet when his book reached Venice, readers fixated on descriptions of silk and spices, skipping past the passages that foretold their own obsolescence. The delay cost Europe dearly. Not until the 1400s, when Ottoman armies battered Constantinople's walls with massive cannons, did Western powers grasp gunpowder's game-changing power. By then, China had been refining firearms for generations, developing multi-stage rockets and even landmines, technologies Polo had glimpsed but couldn't fully contextualize. His writings, though, planted a seed. Italian engineers who studied his notes began experimenting with thunder tubes, laying groundwork for the arquebuses that would later dominate Renaissance battlefields. The lesson here isn't just about technology, it's about perception. Polo's failure to recognize gunpowder's potential mirrored Europe's broader reluctance to learn from the East, a hesitation that would leave them scrambling to catch up when war's rules changed forever. Perhaps the most haunting twist lies in what Polo didn't see. While he documented gunpowder's flash and noise, he missed its quietest revolution, the erosion of feudal power. In China, gunpowder had already begun democratizing warfare, making castles obsolete and reducing the advantage of heavily armored cavalry. Europe's knights, clinging to tradition, would learn this lesson the hard way. Polo's descriptions, though incomplete, were a roadmap to the future, one written in smoke and fire, waiting for the world to read it. Marco Polo leaned over the railing of a grain barge, watching the Grand Canal stretch before him like a liquid highway, 1,100 miles of water linking the Yangtze and Yellow rivers, a feat of engineering that dwarfed anything in Europe. While Venetian merchants hauled goods over the Alps on mule trains, China moved mountains of rice, silk, and porcelain on this aquatic superhighway. Polo counted 40 locks lifting barges over hills, bridges arched high enough for imperial ships to pass beneath, and towpaths where teams of laborers pulled vessels upstream with eerie efficiency. A river made by the hands of men, he called it, a network so vital that the Khan stationed garrisons along its banks to protect the flow of commerce. To Polo, the canal wasn't just infrastructure, it was the empire's beating heart. What made this waterway revolutionary wasn't its scale, but its foresight. Polo documented how engineers designed the canal's gradient to maintain steady currents, avoiding the silt buildup that choked European rivers. He marveled at the mile markers, stone tablets spaced precisely to track distances, and relay stations where fresh horses stood ready to carry urgent messages. While European kings squabbled over toll roads, China's bureaucracy treated the canal as a public good, maintaining dredging crews and emergency granaries along its length. The result, a transport system that moved 4 times the cargo of all Europe's rivers combined, with taxes collected at centralized checkpoints instead of robber baron tolls. Polo watched as a single barge carried enough grain to feed a city for a month, an unthinkable efficiency in a continent where wheelbarrows overturned on muddy trails. The canal's legacy rippled far beyond Polo's time. Dutch engineers studying his accounts later replicated its lock systems in Amsterdam's canals, kickstarting Northern Europe's maritime trade. Napoleon, obsessed with Polo's descriptions, ordered surveys for a similar French network blueprints that eventually inspired the Suez and Panama canals. Even today's container ships owe a debt to the Grand Canal's model of standardized barge sizes and scheduled convoys, but perhaps the most poignant lesson lies in what Polo didn't write. Nowhere did he call the canal a wonder, though it dwarfed the pyramids in labor and scope. To him, its brilliance wasn't in its grandeur, but in its mundanity, proof that true progress isn't about monuments, but systems that uplift everyone. While Europe's castles crumbled, China's canal kept flowing, whispering a truth Polo carried home. Empires rise not on the backs of conquerors, but on the currents of collective ingenuity. Marco Polo watched in quiet astonishment as the physician inserted needles into the patient's skin, not to cause pain, but to relieve it. He described the procedure with meticulous care, slender silver needles placed along invisible pathways, their precise positioning guided by theories of energy flow that made European humoral medicine look crude by comparison. They cure headaches and fevers this way, he wrote, and even make wounded soldiers forget their pain. To a man raised on bloodletting and prayers, acupuncture wasn't just exotic, it was revolutionary. But what truly stunned him was the logic behind it. Chinese doctors didn't guess, they diagnosed. They checked pulses at 3 points on each wrist, distinguishing between dozens of subtle variations that indicated specific organ imbalances. They examined tongues for color and coating, correlating these signs with intricate herbal prescriptions. Polo's notes read like a medical textbook centuries ahead of its time, documenting treatments for ailments Europe wouldn't even name until the Renaissance. Then there were the herbs, not the haphazard potions of European apothecaries, but systematic formulas blending roots, leaves, and minerals in precise ratios. Polo recorded how physicians tailored these remedies to each patient's constitution, adjusting doses like master chefs balancing flavors. He saw ginseng harvested at exact lunar phases for maximum potency, mushrooms brewed into longevity tonics, and even early vaccinations where smallpox scabs were ground into nasal powders to induce immunity. While Parisian doctors blamed illness on bad air or divine punishment, Chinese medicine viewed the body as an interconnected system, treating root causes rather than symptoms. Polo's accounts of pharmacies stocking hundreds of standardized ingredients, each labeled with harvest dates and potency grades, revealed a pharmacopoeia so advanced it wouldn't reach Europe until the 19th century. But his most startling observation came during an outbreak in Hangzhou. As plague swept the city, Polo witnessed something unimaginable in Europe: order. Officials sealed neighborhoods, isolating the sick in designated quarantine houses. Travelers underwent health inspections at city gates, their belongings fumigated with sulfur smoke. Street cleaners scrubbed public spaces with vinegar, while doctors moved through crowds distributing preventive herbal sachets. No one enters or leaves until 40 days pass, Polo noted, describing a protocol nearly identical to modern containment measures. Compare this to Europe's Black Death response just decades later, where panicked crowds fled infected cities, spreading disease faster than any rat fleet. The lesson Polo unwittingly captured: that epidemics aren't acts of God, they're puzzles to be solved, with tools as logical as quarantines and as humble as boiled drinking water. The tragedy isn't that Europe ignored these practices, it's that they had to rediscover them painfully. When the bubonic plague reached Venice in 1348, killing half the population, no one remembered Polo's accounts of containment. When syphilis ravaged Renaissance Europe, doctors resorted to mercury poisoning instead of the antiviral herbs Polo had documented. It wasn't until Jesuit missionaries brought back Chinese medical texts in the 1600s that Europe began systematically studying Eastern methods 5 centuries after Polo first described them. His journals weren't just travelogues, they were a lost opportunity, a roadmap to medical progress buried under layers of disbelief. Yet perhaps Polo's greatest insight wasn't about needles or herbs, but philosophy. He recognized that Eastern medicine's power came from seeing health as a collective endeavor, where street cleaning was as vital as surgery, and where preventing illness held more prestige than curing it. In an age when European kings boasted about their personal physicians, Polo wrote of public hospitals where anyone, even the poorest beggar, could receive care. That vision of medicine as a right, not a privilege, would take the world another 700 years to fully embrace. So when we read his astonished descriptions of acupuncture or quarantines, we're not just seeing ancient practices. We're witnessing the birth of an idea that healing begins not with miracles, but with observation, empathy, and the courage to learn from those who see the body differently. And that, more than any single treatment, may be Marco Polo's most enduring medical prophecy. Marco Polo tilted his head skyward, watching as a silk-winged kite danced on the wind, not as a child's toy, but as a messenger streaking across the heavens. He documented kites so large they could lift a grown man into the air, their bamboo frames rigged with harnesses and strings strong enough to carry written scrolls between mountain outposts. To Venetian eyes, the idea of kites as tools seemed ludicrous, a flight of fancy. But in China, where these wind horses had been perfecting airmail for centuries, Polo witnessed a technology that blurred the line between myth and mechanics. The genius lay in their simplicity. Chinese engineers had mastered the aerodynamics of kite design, tailoring shapes to harness specific wind currents. Dragon kites with segmented bodies that rippled like serpents, flat rectangles that hovered steady as falcons. Polo described military scouts using kites to survey enemy positions from impossible heights. Their observations signaled back to the ground with colored ribbons. Even more astonishing were the fire kite's night flights, equipped with lanterns that transformed into floating beacons, guiding ships or marking festival celebrations. While Europe's armies relied on smoke signals and couriers, China had built an aerial communication network centuries before the telegraph. What Polo couldn't have known was how prescient his observations would prove. When European scientists finally took kites seriously in the 18th century, they unlocked breakthroughs that reshaped the modern world. Benjamin Franklin's famous lightning experiment. Conducted with a kite, early meteorologists used them to study atmospheric layers, while aviation pioneers like the Wright brothers tested wing designs on kite frames before their first flight. Even today, NASA employs kite-like parafoils to land rovers on Mars. Polo's accounts weren't just descriptions, they were a challenge to reimagine humble tools as instruments of progress. Yet the deeper revelation wasn't about the kites themselves, it was about the mindset behind them. Chinese culture didn't separate art from utility. A kite could be a painted masterpiece and a postal service simultaneously. Polo noted how children learned physics by building miniature versions, how festivals celebrated both the beauty and function of flight. In Europe, where technology and aesthetics often occupied separate realms, this fusion of form and function was revolutionary. His writings hinted at a truth we're still grasping. Innovation thrives where imagination isn't bound by categories. The kites Polo admired didn't just carry messages, they carried a philosophy, one that saw the wind itself as a road waiting to be traveled. The irony, while Europe dismissed kite lifting as fantasy, they later borrowed the technology for military reconnaissance in World War I and weather research in the 20th century. Polo's prediction wasn't just about a single invention, it was a lesson in humility. Progress often wears the guise of the familiar, if only we have the eyes to see its potential. Those silk wings fluttering over Hangzhou weren't just playthings. They were the blueprint for humanity's conquest of the skies, sketched centuries before the world thought to look up. In the bustling markets of Hangzhou, Marco Polo watched as shopkeepers calculated sums not with clumsy tally marks, but with elegant brushstrokes, writing invoices and contracts with a fluency that would shame most European nobles. This wasn't some elite class of scribes. These were fishmongers, weavers, and tea sellers conducting business with the effortless literacy of scholars. Polo's journals brim with disbelief at the sheer scale of education in the Yuan dynasty, where even remote villages had schools and imperial exams determined government posts based on merit, not birthright. They study the classics as children, he wrote, and the wisest among them, though born in poverty, may rise to govern provinces. For a Venetian raised in a world where knowledge was hoarded by monks and aristocrats, China's culture of learning felt like witnessing the future. The system Polo described was staggeringly modern. Boys, and in some regions, girls attended community schools from age 6, memorizing Confucian texts while mastering calligraphy and arithmetic. But rote learning was just the foundation. The real marvel was the imperial examination system, a grueling series of tests open to all except slaves and criminals. Polo documented how candidates spent days in isolated exam cells composing essays on governance, poetry, and ethics, their papers judged anonymously to prevent favoritism. Successful examinees weren't just awarded titles, they were given real administrative power, their ranks marked by distinctive gowns and caps that commanded respect regardless of family lineage. While Europe's nobles inherited their positions, China's bureaucrats earned theirs through intellectual rigor, a concept so radical, Polo's European readers dismissed it as fantasy. What made this approach revolutionary wasn't just accessibility, but its philosophy. Education in China wasn't merely about personal advancement, it was the glue holding society together. Polo noted how village elders quoted legal codes during disputes, how farmers debated poetry during harvest festivals, and how even soldiers carried miniature libraries of strategy texts. Literacy wasn't a luxury, it was a civic duty. The Khan's government distributed standardized textbooks to remote regions, ensuring every potential talent pool was tapped. Compare this to medieval Europe, where the Lord's Prayer was often the extent of a peasant's reading, and kings signed documents with an X well into the Renaissance. Polo's accounts hinted at a truth Europe would take centuries to grasp, that a nation's strength lies not in its weapons, but in its collective mind. The echoes of this system are everywhere today. Modern civil service exams from Tokyo to Paris trace their roots to China's meritocratic model. The idea that education should be universal, not elitist, became the cornerstone of Enlightenment reforms. Even the concept of standardized testing, now a global rite of passage, owes its existence to those ink-stained exam halls Polo wandered. Yet his most profound observation wasn't about tests or schools, but about the culture they created. In a society where knowledge was the true currency, innovation flourished. The same farmers who read Confucius also pioneered crop rotation techniques. The clerks who memorized poetry invented water clocks and movable type. Polo unknowingly predicted the engine of progress itself, that when a nation educates broadly, it doesn't just fill bureaucratic seats, it unlocks the latent genius of its people. Perhaps that's why his descriptions of Chinese classrooms feel so eerily prescient. The competitive exams he witnessed weren't so different from today's college entrance tests. The emphasis on memorization and critical thinking mirrors modern pedagogical debates. Even the stressed candidates felt Polo wrote of examinees fainting from exhaustion feels uncomfortably familiar. But beneath these surface parallels lies a deeper lesson Polo himself might have missed. The true brilliance of China's system wasn't in its rigor, but in its underlying faith that talent is distributed equally across social strata, waiting only for opportunity to draw it out. In an age when Europe's aristocracy clung to divine right, Polo recorded a civilization that believed in something far more radical. That wisdom could bloom anywhere if only society bothered to till the soil. Marco Polo cradled the bowl in his hands, marveling at how something so delicate could feel so impossibly strong. The porcelain gleamed like polished moonlight, so thin he could almost see his fingers through its translucent walls. They take white clay and bake it in fierce fires, he wrote, until it becomes like glass, yet rings like silver when struck. To Venetian merchants accustomed to coarse earthenware, this white gold seemed alchemy, a substance both ethereal and indestructible. Polo described kilns that burned hotter than European furnaces, firing clay for days at temperatures that would melt ordinary pottery. While his contemporaries shaped vessels from lumpy local clays, Chinese artisans worked with kaolin, a fine, white earth mined from specific hillsides, its composition a closely guarded secret. The sophistication didn't stop at materials. Polo documented assembly lines where specialists shaped, painted, and glazed pieces in stages, each artisan honing a single skill to perfection. He watched painters depict landscapes with brushes made of a single mouse hair, their cobalt pigments imported from Persia to create the iconic blue and white designs. Most astonishing were the kiln technologies, massive brick structures with precisely placed vents to control airflow, stacking systems that allowed hundreds of pieces to fire simultaneously, and even pyrometric cones, small clay indicators that melted at specific temperatures, signaling when the heat had reached ideal conditions. Europe's potters working in rudimentary ovens couldn't fathom such precision. When Polo claimed these wares survived boiling water without cracking, his readers dismissed it as another Oriental tall tale. Yet buried in his descriptions lay the very clues that would crack porcelain's code centuries later. His mention of white earth from Jailing, kaolin, gave German alchemists their first lead in 1708 when they scoured Saxony for similar deposits. His notes on kiln construction inspired masons' craftsmen to build multi-chambered ovens mimicking Chinese designs. Even his passing reference to ashes mixed with limestone revealed the secret of glaze chemistry, a flux that fused silica into glass at lower temperatures. Like a culinary recipe with missing steps, Polo's accounts provided just enough ingredients to ignite Europe's porcelain fever, though it took 300 years of trial and error to recreate what China had perfected by the Tang dynasty. The irony, while Europeans obsessed over mimicking porcelain's appearance, Polo had glimpsed its deeper significance. In China, these weren't just dishes, they were diplomatic tools. He described how the Khan gifted porcelain to foreign envoys, its fragility symbolizing the care required in international relations. Court officials used specific patterns to denote rank, and tea masters prized certain glazes for enhancing flavor. Porcelain wasn't merely art, it was language, status, and technology fused into clay. When Mason finally replicated it in 1710, their triumph wasn't just in cracking a chemical formula, but in unlocking a cultural code Polo had transcribed centuries earlier. His prediction that the East's true mastery lay not in objects, but in the systems of knowledge that created them systems Europe would spend centuries reverse engineering from his handwritten pages. Marco Polo never wrote the words Great Wall, and for centuries scholars used this omission to dismiss his credibility. But what if we've been reading his accounts all wrong? Hidden in his descriptions of the Khan's empire lies a striking passage about ramparts of earth and stone stretching farther than the eye can see, manned by garrisons who lit beacon fires at the first sign of trouble. These weren't vague musings, they matched precisely with sections of the Great Wall in the northwest, far from the tourist-beloved Ming Dynasty fortifications near Beijing. Polo wasn't inaccurate. He was documenting parts of the wall most Europeans wouldn't learn about for another 500 years. The confusion stems from a simple twist of history. By Polo's time, the original Qin dynasty walls along China's northern frontier had eroded into earthen mounds, their once imposing faces softened by centuries of wind and rain. What remained were fortified outposts and watchtowers, exactly the structures Polo described guarding trade routes near the Gobi Desert. Later Ming emperors would rebuild the wall closer to the capital, creating the iconic stone barrier we recognize today. But Polo walked among the ruins of an older, equally strategic defense system, one archaeologists have only recently mapped using satellite imagery. His oversight wasn't a failure of observation. It was a testament to how thoroughly the past can vanish, even from something as colossal as the Great Wall. Why did historians miss this for so long, blame the allure of the spectacular? When Jesuit missionaries reached China in the 16th century, they marveled at the Ming Wall's grandeur, assuming these were the only walls that ever mattered. Polo's humbler descriptions of packed earth barriers didn't fit the towering image Europeans expected, so they were dismissed as errors, yet modern excavations prove him right. Near Dunhuang, where Polo traveled, remnants of Han Dynasty walls still stand 20 feet thick at the base, reinforced with layers of tamarisk branches and gravel, exactly as he noted. These weren't just passive barriers, they were active military zones where patrols monitored nomadic movements and taxed Silk Road caravans. Polo even recorded how the Khan stationed multilingual soldiers along these forts to interrogate travelers, a detail corroborated by Yuan dynasty payroll records found in the 1990s. The lesson here isn't just about correcting a historical misconception. It's about how easily we conflate visibility with importance. The Great Wall wasn't a single, static monument. It was a living network adapting over centuries. Polo's descriptions captured its essence as a system, not just bricks and mortar, but a web of communication, logistics, and control. While later visitors fixated on the wall's physical might, Polo saw its true genius, not as an impenetrable barrier, but as a nervous system sensing every tremor along the empire's frontiers. That insight, buried in plain sight for 700 years, might be his most subtle prediction of all, that the past is rarely what it seems, and truth often lingers in the overlooked details. Marco Polo knelt in a Buddhist temple, the scent of sandalwood thick in the air as monks chanted sutras, then stepped outside to hear the muezzins call to prayer from a nearby mosque, followed by the distant chime of a Nestorian Christian bell. This wasn't some utopian fantasy. It was daily life in Kublai Khan's capital, where three faiths mingled with a harmony unimaginable in crusade-torn Europe. Polo's journals brim with astonishment at this religious tapestry, Buddhist lamas debating Taoist sages, Muslim merchants praying beside Christian envoys, all under the Khan's policy of respect for all paths to heaven. While popes preached holy war, Polo documented a realm where diversity wasn't merely tolerated, it was woven into governance. The secret lay in pragmatism, not piety. Polo noted how the Khan appointed administrators from each faith to oversee their own communities, creating a system of self-rule that prevented sectarian strife. Buddhist monasteries handled civil disputes among their followers, Islamic cadis applied Sharia law for Muslims, and Nestorian bishops arbitrated for Christians. This wasn't multiculturalism as we understand it today. It was a calculated strategy to stabilize a vast empire. By allowing subjects to live under familiar spiritual laws, the Mongols ensured loyalty without brute force. Polo recognized the genius in this approach, writing how the Khan wins the hearts of conquered peoples by honoring their gods. Compare this to Europe's endless wars of conversion, where rulers demanded uniformity at sword point, and the contrast couldn't be starker. What Polo glimpsed was the birth of an idea that faith needn't be a battleground. He described Buddhist temples sharing courtyards with mosques, their monks and imams exchanging medical knowledge. He witnessed Christian physicians adopting acupuncture from Taoist healers, and Muslim astronomers collaborating with Confucian scholars to refine calendars. This cross-pollination wasn't accidental, it was institutional. The Khan's academy in Konbalik employed scholars from every tradition, translating Greek medicine, Persian mathematics, and Chinese philosophy into multiple languages. While Europe's universities excommunicated heretics, Yuan China's libraries became crucibles of hybrid wisdom. The tragedy: Europe dismissed these accounts as fables. When Polo described the Khan asking 3 priests, Buddhist, Christian, and Muslim, to pray for his healing, then rewarding all equally regardless of outcome, readers scoffed. Such neutrality contradicted everything they knew about religion's role in power. Yet buried in his observations was a blueprint for pluralism that wouldn't take root in the West until the Enlightenment. His descriptions of interfaith marriages, shared festivals, and hybrid art styles like Christian icons painted with Chinese brushwork revealed a society where identity wasn't singular but layered. Perhaps Polo's greatest insight was recognizing that tolerance wasn't weakness but strength. The Yuan dynasty's religious flexibility allowed it to govern 200 million people across 50 ethnic groups, a scale unthinkable for Europe's fractured kingdoms. When the Black Death later ravaged a divided Christendom, China's collaborative medical traditions, born from this pluralism, mitigated the pandemic's toll. The lesson Polo carried home wasn't about theology, but survival. Civilizations that embrace multiplicity endure. 7 centuries later, as our world grapples with globalization's clashes, his account of 13th century harmony feels less like history and more like prophecy. Marco Polo raised the delicate porcelain cup to his lips, inhaling an aroma unlike anything in Venice, earthy, grassy, with a hint of something almost floral. The warm liquid tasted faintly bitter at first, then left a surprising sweetness on his tongue. This wasn't just a drink, it was an entire ceremony, performed with the precision of a sacred ritual. Polo watched as the tea master heated water to exact temperatures, measured leaves with carved bamboo scoops, and poured in slow, deliberate motions meant to awaken the spirit of the leaf. To European eyes accustomed to guzzling ale by the flagon, this careful choreography seemed absurd, but Polo sensed something deeper. They value this herb more than gold, he wrote, noting how Mongol nobles traded bricks of pressed tea as currency, and how physicians prescribed specific blends for ailments ranging from indigestion to melancholy. What fascinated him most was tea's invisible infrastructure. He documented mountain plantations where workers harvested only the youngest leaves at dawn, their fingers moving with practiced speed to preserve delicate flavors. He described imperial warehouses where tea bricks aged like wine, their value increasing with time. Most startling were the tea horses, caravans of Tibetan ponies trudging along narrow cliffside trails, each animal carrying 200 pounds of compressed leaves in exchange for war horses needed by the Chinese military. This wasn't just commerce, it was geopolitics in a teacup. Polo estimated that one particularly prized variety, a golden tea from Fujian, cost 30 times its weight in silver, a detail so outrageous his editor scribbled, "Impossible." In the manuscript's margin, yet archaeological finds have since confirmed tea's staggering worth. Song dynasty tax records show it accounted for nearly half of some provinces' revenues. Europe's skepticism wasn't just about taste, it was cultural blindness. When Polo described tea's health benefits, his readers scoffed. How could boiled leaves cure headaches or aid digestion? Yet Chinese pharmacopoeias had catalogued these properties for centuries. Polo recorded physicians using pu-erh tea to treat dysentery, green tea to sharpen focus during exams, and chrysanthemum-infused blends to cool fevers. Modern science now confirms these ancient claims. Tea's catechins do combat bacteria, its L-theanine enhances alertness, and its antioxidants reduce inflammation. The real revelation in Polo's notes isn't that he reported these uses, it's that he recognized their significance. While European doctors still prescribed mercury for syphilis, he was documenting a preventive medicine tradition rooted in daily ritual. The twist: Polo never actually brought tea to Europe. His accounts described it as a curiosity, not a commodity. Venetian merchants obsessed with spices and silk ignored this hot leaf water for 3 more centuries until Dutch traders finally imported it in 1610. By then, China's tea monopoly was so entrenched that Britain's addiction to the beverage would spark the Opium Wars. Had Polo's contemporaries grasped tea's potential, history might have unfolded differently. His oversight wasn't in failing to recognize tea's value, but in underestimating Europe's resistance to new ideas. The same man who predicted paper money and coal couldn't imagine his own people adopting a drink that required patience to prepare and palate to appreciate. Perhaps that's the enduring lesson of Polo's Tea Chronicles. True cultural exchange isn't just about discovering novelty, it's about developing the capacity to appreciate it. The tea ceremonies he witnessed weren't merely about consumption. They were meditations on mindfulness, respect for nature's gifts, and the art of slowing down. While Europe raced toward the frenetic energy of coffeehouses, China had perfected the antidote to haste centuries earlier. Polo's greatest prediction wasn't about tea as a product, but about the values it represented. A vision of civilization where even something as simple as a drink could carry the weight of philosophy. And in that, he was more prescient than even he knew. Marco Polo stood before a towering contraption of brass and wood, its gears turning with a rhythmic precision that defied everything he knew about timekeeping. Water trickled through carefully calibrated channels, powering a mechanism that moved not just our hands, but miniature figures that struck bells and even displayed celestial movements. They divide the day into 24 equal parts, he wrote, astonished by clocks that measured time in consistent hours regardless of season, a concept foreign to Europe where daylight hours stretched and shrank with the sun's whim. These weren't just devices, they were masterpieces of engineering, some standing 3 stories tall in imperial courtyards, their chimes synchronizing entire cities. The secret lay in centuries of incremental innovation. Chinese horologists had perfected water clocks since the Han Dynasty, adding escapement mechanisms by the Tang era to regulate flow. a breakthrough Europe wouldn't replicate until medieval cathedral clocks. Polo described clock towers with multiple dials tracking not only hours but planetary positions, tidal patterns, and auspicious dates for planting crops. While European monks guessed time by shadow sticks or sunglasses, China's bureaucrats scheduled tax collections, market openings, and courier departures to the exact key, a unit of time equal to 14.4 minutes. The Khan's astronomers even calibrated clocks using star observations, achieving accuracy within minutes per month. Polo's notes reveal a society where time wasn't felt but quantified, where punctuality wasn't courtesy but law. What truly set Eastern clocks apart was their purpose. Unlike Europe's monastic timekeepers, which merely signaled prayer hours, Chinese horology served the state. Polo documented how imperial messengers raced between relay stations timed by synchronized water clocks, ensuring dispatches crossed the empire at predictable speeds. Market supervisors used mechanical timers to enforce fair trading hours, while naval commanders coordinated maneuvers with shipboard clepsydras. This wasn't just about precision, it was about control. The Yuan dynasty didn't just measure time, they weaponized it, turning regularity into an instrument of governance. The bitter irony, Polo's descriptions of gear-driven astronomical clocks reached Europe just as mechanical timekeeping was emerging there, but scholars dismissed them as fantasies. It wasn't until Jesuit missionaries brought back Chinese clock designs in the 16th century that Europe recognized their debt to Eastern ingenuity. By then, the mechanical clock had become the heartbeat of Western industrialization, its gears powering factories and railroads, yet the foundational principles, escapements, gear trains, even the concept of standardized hours had flourished in China centuries earlier. Polo's accounts weren't merely observations, they were a missed roadmap, one that could have accelerated Europe's technological ascent had anyone bothered to follow it. Perhaps the most poignant lesson lies in what these clocks symbolized. While Europe's timepieces adorned church towers proclaiming divine order, China served earthly masters, binding vast territories through shared rhythms. Polo unknowingly predicted the modern world's obsession with efficiency, a realm where time isn't just marked but monetized. Those water-driven marvels he admired weren't just machines, they were the first ticking pulses of globalization, synchronizing a civilization long before the West learned to watch the clock. The docks of Quanzhou stretched as far as Marco Polo could see, a forest of masts swaying against the horizon, but these were no ordinary ships. Towering above the Venetian galleys of his homeland floated wooden giants, their multiple decks stacked like pagodas, their hulls reinforced with watertight compartments that made European shipbuilding seem primitive by comparison. Some carry 300 men, Polo wrote of these floating fortresses, with 4 masts and sails of woven bamboo that never tear. To European eyes, such claims bordered on fantasy until 20th century archaeologists discovered the wreck of a Song dynasty junk off the coast of Korea, its preserved timbers measuring over 100 feet long, its bulk confirming Polo's accounts word for word. What made these vessels so revolutionary wasn't just their size, but their sophistication. Polo documented how Chinese shipwrights used iron nails instead of wooden pegs, creating frames that flexed with storms rather than shattered. He marveled at the compartmentalized hulls, a design feature allowing damaged sections to be sealed off while the ship stayed afloat, a safety innovation Europe wouldn't adopt until the 1800s. Most astonishing were the technologies on board. Magnetic compasses housed in jade boxes to prevent interference, mechanical bilge pumps operated by treadmill, even primitive paddle wheels powered by crews walking on treadmills, an early form of mechanized propulsion. While European sailors still hugged coastlines fearing open water, Chinese admirals commanded fleets that could cross oceans. the real game changer lay in logistics. Polo described naval warehouses stocking prefabricated ship parts, allowing damaged vessels to be repaired at any major port using standardized components. He saw dry docks large enough to accommodate multiple junks simultaneously, where teams of engineers scaled bamboo scaffolds to caulk hulls with tung oil and lime mixtures. This wasn't just boat building, it was maritime industrialization, a system capable of producing hundreds of ocean-going vessels annually. Compare this to Europe's piecemeal approach, where each ship was essentially handmade, and the disparity becomes staggering. When Zheng He's treasure fleet sailed to Africa decades later with 27,000 crewmen aboard 317 ships, they weren't defying the odds, they were fulfilling the potential Polo had glimpsed. Yet the most telling detail in Polo's accounts isn't about technology, it's about mindset. He noted how Chinese admirals carried extensive libraries of star charts and tide tables, how crews practiced fire drills with precisely timed water bucket chains, how every sailor knew basic celestial navigation. These weren't just ships, they were floating universities where knowledge mattered as much as manpower. While European navies relied on brute strength and short voyages, China's maritime culture prioritized preparation and endurance. Polo's descriptions of rice stores carefully rotated to prevent spoilage, or citrus fruits carried to combat scurvy, reveal a logistical foresight Europe wouldn't match until the age of exploration. The bitter twist: Europe dismissed these insights when they needed them most. When Portuguese caravels finally rounded Africa in the 15th century, their captains struggled with scurvy, leaks, and mutinies, problems Chinese mariners had solved centuries earlier. Had Polo's accounts been taken seriously, the balance of naval power might have shifted differently. Those massive junks he admired weren't just ships, they were floating prophecies, proof that mastery of the seas began not with bigger sails but with smarter systems. And in that, Marco Polo didn't just describe naval history, he predicted its future. Marco Polo watched in quiet fascination as the magistrate reached for a stack of thin, absorbent papers after his meal, not to write but to wipe. To Venetian eyes, the idea of using paper for personal hygiene seemed as absurd as burning gold for warmth. They used these sheets once, then cast them away, he wrote, noting how even wealthy households stocked piles of this toilet paper, while European nobility still scratched at themselves with straw, moss, or, if they were fortunate, a shared sponge on a stick. The contrast couldn't have been starker. In 13th century Hangzhou, government offices distributed standardized hygiene paper to civil servants, while London's streets ran with filth from chamber pots emptied directly into the Thames. The sophistication went beyond mere materials. Polo documented how different grades of paper served different purposes: coarse hemp sheets for common use, softer mulberry blends for the imperial court, even perfumed varieties for aristocratic households. He described public lavatories with stacked seating and running water channels that flushed waste into sealed cesspits, their walls hung with paper dispensers. While Europe's castles reeked of excrement trapped in garderobe chutes, China's cities had municipal sanitation crews who collected waste for fertilizer, a system both hygienic and ecologically sound. Polo's accounts reveal a civilization that didn't just tolerate cleanliness, they systematized it, turning bodily functions into matters of civic order. So why did Europe dismiss these practices for 500 years? The answer lies in cultural blind spots. Medieval Christians viewed excessive cleanliness as vanity. Some even considered dirt a sign of piety. When Polo described Chinese bathing rituals involving steam rooms and daily hair washing, his readers scoffed, associating such habits with Eastern decadence. Paper itself was a luxury in Europe, painstakingly made from expensive linen rags. The notion of wasting it on sanitation seemed obscene. But beneath these surface differences lurked a deeper divide. Where China saw hygiene as preventative medicine, Europe still clung to miasma theory, blaming diseases on bad air rather than filth. Polo's observations about paper's role in reducing contagion, how sickrooms used disposable sheets to isolate contamination, fell on deaf ears. The turning point came through tragedy. When bubonic plague ravaged 14th century Europe, killing a third of the population, survivors noticed Jewish communities suffered lower mortality rates. The reason: ritual hand-washing and waste disposal practices borrowed from Middle Eastern and Asian traditions. Yet even this lesson took centuries to sink in. Not until the 19th century, when cholera outbreaks forced London to build sewer systems, did the West fully grasp the connection Polo had documented between sanitation and survival. By then, China had been mass-producing toilet paper for nearly a millennium, its mills churning out stacks of hygienic sheets while Victorians still clipped newspaper scraps into makeshift bathroom squares. The real revelation in Polo's account isn't about paper, it's about paradigm shifts. He witnessed a culture that viewed cleanliness not as indulgence, but as infrastructure, as vital as roads or granaries. Modern archaeology confirms his claims. Excavations of Song dynasty latrines show layered ash and lime for odor control, along with remnants of hemp paper bearing imperial quality seals. These weren't crude solutions, they were engineered systems as meticulously planned as China's canal networks. Polo's prediction then wasn't merely that paper would someday grace bathrooms worldwide. It was that civilizations flourish when they prioritize the mundane details of daily life. After all, what greater measure of progress exists than how a society cares for its most basic human needs? Marco Polo paused in the marketplace of Kublai, watching as a woman in embroidered silks haggled fiercely over a shipment of Persian spices, not as a merchant's wife but as the owner herself. This wasn't some rare exception, it was an ordinary scene in the Yuan dynasty where women ran textile workshops, financed caravans, and even managed state-run breweries. Widows commonly inherit their husbands' trades, he wrote, stunned by the sight of female moneylenders issuing loans to male customers. For a Venetian raised in a world where women needed male guardians to buy property, Mongol China's commercial landscape felt like stepping into another century. What made Eastern gender norms so strikingly different? Polo's observations point to a cultural alchemy of pragmatism and tradition. Nomadic Mongol society had long valued women's labor herding, tanning hides, and managing camps while men hunted or waged war. When Kublai Khan unified China, he didn't impose Mongol customs wholesale. He blended them with local practices like Song dynasty inheritance laws that permitted daughters to inherit land. The result was a hybrid system where women could own seals, the medieval equivalent of signing contracts, sue in courts, and even serve as tax collectors. Polo documented female physicians charging fees for consultations, silk guilds governed by matriarchs, and aristocratic women like the famed Chabai Khotun, Kublai's favorite wife, orchestrating international trade deals. While European women were burning spindles to protest exclusion from weaving guilds, their Chinese counterparts were filing patents for improved looms. The real revelation wasn't just legal rights, but social attitudes. Polo noted how Mongol women dined publicly with men unthinkable in Venice's gender-segregated feasts, and rode horses astride rather than side saddle. He described queens like Manjuhai who led armies, and princesses like Kirkachin who negotiated diplomatic marriages as political partners, not pawns. Even religious barriers crumbled. Buddhist nunneries operated as de facto banks, lending capital to farmers, while Taoist temples celebrated female deities of commerce. This wasn't equality by modern standards. Polygamy persisted, and foot binding began creeping in, but compared to Europe's rigid gender binary, Polo was witnessing a spectrum of economic agency. Why did these norms startle him so deeply? Because they exposed the artificiality of Europe's restrictions. When Polo wrote of a Hangzhou widow who expanded her late husband's porcelain business into an empire with 300 kilns, his editor assumed hyperbole until archaeologists unearthed ledgers confirming such enterprises. When he mentioned women inspecting cargo at docks, readers dismissed it as Oriental exoticism. Yet tax records from Quanzhou show female merchants paying import duties on pepper and ivory alongside men. The Khan's government cared about revenue, not the gender of those generating it, a utilitarian approach that accidentally fostered meritocracy, the bitter irony. Europe's eventual enlightenment on women's roles came centuries later and only partially. While Renaissance Florence restricted women's bank accounts, Ming China was still appointing female magistrates to oversee market regulations. Polo's accounts suggest an uncomfortable truth, that economic progress often depends not on lofty ideals but on sheer necessity. When empires expand, talent can't afford to be halved by prejudice. His most radical prediction wasn't about silk or ships. It was that civilizations thrive when they unlock all their human potential, not just half of it. And in that, he was centuries ahead of his time. Marco Polo sat cross-legged on a silk cushion, staring at the steaming bowl set before him, long, golden strands coiled in fragrant broth, topped with slivers of meat and vibrant greens. "They make these from wheat flour," he wrote, "kneaded into dough so thin it resembles thread, then boiled quick as a blink." Noodles weren't just food in the Yuan dynasty. They were artistry, their preparation elevated to near ritual status. Polo documented street vendors stretching dough with acrobatic flair, their arms whirling like windmills as they pulled strands thinner than Venetian lace. To a man raised on coarse barley bread and pottage, this was culinary alchemy. But what truly astonished him was the scale. Noodles served at every meal, from peasant huts to imperial banquets, in broths clear as amber or sauces thick with fermented beans. While Europe's idea of pasta amounted to dense, unleavened lumps, China had perfected textures ranging from chewy hand-pulled biang-biang noodles to delicate wonton wrappers thinner than parchment. The revelation wasn't just in the noodles themselves, but in the ecosystem surrounding them. Polo described mountain villages where ice cut from frozen lakes in winter was packed in straw and salt, stored in deep cellars to preserve summer delicacies, an early form of refrigeration that allowed nobles to enjoy chilled desserts year-round. He tasted shaved ice drizzled with fruit syrups and milk, a proto-ice cream that left him bewitched by its sweetness. Spice markets overflowed with aromas Europe had never encountered. Sichuan peppercorns that numbed the tongue, black cardamom with its smoky depth, and cinnamon bark from Sri Lanka so prized it was weighed with silver scales. These weren't mere ingredients, they were currencies of power traded along routes stretching from Java to Persia. Consider the ripple effect of these culinary revelations. When Polo returned to Venice with tales of noodles, local cooks began experimenting with durum wheat, eventually creating the dried pasta that would fuel Mediterranean trade. His accounts of ice storage inspired Renaissance aristocrats to build ice houses modeled on Asian designs. The spices he catalogued, pepper, cloves, nutmeg, became the driving force behind Europe's age of exploration, launching expeditions to circumvent Arab middlemen. Yet the deepest impact lay in philosophy. Chinese cuisine, as Polo witnessed it, wasn't just about sustenance. It balanced flavors, textures, and even medicinal properties with a sophistication Europe wouldn't match until the Enlightenment. A typical Yuan dynasty meal might pair cooling melon with warming ginger or offset fatty pork with vinegar's sharpness, a harmony of opposites that mirrored Taoist principles. The bitter irony, Europe embraced the products but missed the wisdom. While Italian pasta and French ice cream became global icons, the holistic approach Polo documented food as medicine, seasonality as sacred, waste as taboo took centuries to gain Western traction. His descriptions of soup kitchens distributing noodles to the poor or imperial edicts mandating grain reserves against famine revealed a society where feeding people was governance. Modern nutrition science now confirms ancient Chinese practices, fermented foods aiding digestion, bone broth strengthening immunity, tea counteracting greasy meals. Polo's greatest culinary prediction wasn't about any single dish, but about a truth we're still digesting, that how a civilization eats reflects its deepest values. And in that, his bowl of noodles held more than flavor. It held a mirror to the future. Marco Polo stood at the crossroads of the known world, Samarkand's bustling bazaar, where Persian silver coins traded hands for Chinese silk, where Venetian glass beads were bartered for Indian spices, and where languages mingled as freely as the scents of sandalwood and saffron. This wasn't just a marketplace, it was the nervous system of a planet already interconnected, a preview of the globalized future Polo alone seemed to grasp. His journals didn't merely describe trade routes, they revealed a truth medieval Europe refused to accept, that the Silk Road wasn't just a path for goods, but a living network of ideas, technologies, and cultures flowing ceaselessly between continents. While European kings still dreamed of isolated self-sufficiency, Polo documented a world where prosperity depended on interdependence, where the Khan's postal relays could deliver a message from Beijing to Baghdad faster than a Venetian letter could cross Italy. What made Polo's vision so revolutionary wasn't just the scale of trade, but his understanding of its ripple effects. He noted how Chinese gunpowder recipes migrated west with Persian alchemists, how Arabic numerals originally from India streamlined Mongol tax records, and how Byzantine glassmaking techniques resurfaced in Yuan dynasty mosaics. Every caravan carried more than cargo, it carried the seeds of progress. When Polo described Hangzhou's foreign quarter, a neighborhood where Muslim engineers built water clocks alongside Jewish doctors compounding medicines, he wasn't just listing exotic sights. He was chronicling the birth of a phenomenon we now recognize as globalization, centuries before container ships and fiber optic cables. The Silk Road's true commodity wasn't silk, but synergy, the alchemy that occurs when civilizations collide and collaborate. Consider the parallels to our modern world. Polo's descriptions of standardized weights and measures across the Mongol Empire foreshadowed today's international trade regulations. His awe at the Khan's protected trade lanes policed to ensure merchant safety mirrors contemporary shipping lanes patrolled against piracy. Even the Silk Road's dark sides feel eerily familiar. Polo wrote of trade imbalances draining silver from Europe to China, of epidemic diseases hitchhiking along caravan routes, and of trade wars where Venetian glassblowers imitated Chinese porcelain to undercut imports. The lessons buried in his accounts resonate deeply in an age of supply chain crises and vaccine diplomacy, proof that connectivity brings both promise and peril. Yet Polo's greatest insight was recognizing that globalization wasn't about erasing differences, but leveraging them. He marveled at how Persian astronomers in Beijing adapted Chinese star charts to improve their own, how Tibetan medicinal herbs blended with Arabic pharmacology in Mongol hospitals, how Uyghur translators melded poetry styles across 3 languages. This wasn't homogenization, it was cross-pollination, where distinct traditions fused into something new without surrendering their identities. Modern economists call this comparative advantage, the principle that nations thrive by specializing in what they do best and trading for the rest. Polo saw it in practice 700 years earlier, watching Turkic horsemen trade steppe-bred stallions for Sichuan tea, each side profiting from the other's strength. The tragedy: Europe ignored these lessons at its peril. When the Black Death swept the continent in the 14th century, killing millions, quarantines failed partly because no one remembered Polo's accounts of Mongol health inspectors isolating sick travelers at caravanserais. When Portugal's explorers finally reached India by sea, they wasted decades fighting middlemen Polo had documented as essential partners. Even Columbus, clutching a dog-eared copy of Polo's book, misunderstood the very trade networks he sought to shortcut, leading him to call Caribbean natives Indians in stubborn denial of the interconnected world Polo had mapped. Today, as satellites trace digital Silk Roads across the internet, Polo's predictions feel less like history and more like prophecy. The cargo planes crisscrossing continents, the undersea cables transmitting data at light speed, even the cultural hybrids of global cuisine, all were prefigured in his accounts of camel caravans carrying not just spices, but scrolls of algebra, samples of vaccines, and blueprints for water mills. His 20th prediction wasn't about any single technology or tradition. It was the radical notion that human progress has always been, and will always be, a team sport. The Silk Road's legacy isn't preserved in museums. It pulses through every smartphone assembled across borders, every idea that leaps between languages, every crisis that reminds us how deeply our fates are woven together. Marco Polo didn't just walk the Silk Road. He saw the future it was building, one where the distance between East and West was never a matter of miles, but of openness to the truths carried on the wind. Marco Polo's legacy isn't just a collection of travel stories, it's a masterclass in the power of observation. At a time when most of Europe saw the East through a haze of myth and prejudice, he stepped beyond the boundaries of his own upbringing to document truths that would reshape the world. His predictions weren't mystical prophecies, they were the logical conclusions of a mind trained to see patterns where others saw only strangeness. When he described paper money, coal, or quarantine protocols, he wasn't merely reporting curiosities, he was holding up a mirror to Europe's future, revealing paths it hadn't yet imagined. Think about the sheer audacity of his vision. While feudal lords squabbled over strips of land, Polo was chronicling an empire where governance meant granaries for the poor, where commerce flowed along canals instead of muddy trails, where medicine prioritized prevention over bloodletting. His accounts read like a checklist of modernity: standardized currencies, public health systems, even the idea that talent, not birthright, should determine leadership. The most astonishing part, he didn't just witness these innovations, he recognized their potential to transform societies far beyond China's borders. That's why his predictions feel less like historical footnotes and more like a time traveler's field notes, each one a glimpse into a world that hadn't yet arrived. Yet for all their accuracy, Polo's insights also carry a bittersweet lesson: Europe's reluctance to embrace these ideas, dismissing them as exaggerations or impossibilities, cost centuries of progress. Imagine if Venetian bankers had adopted paper currency in 1300 instead of 1700, or if medieval doctors had studied Chinese pulse diagnosis instead of burning plague victims with hot irons. The delay wasn't just about skepticism. It was a failure of imagination, a refusal to believe that civilizations beyond Christendom could hold answers to Europe's struggles. Polo's greatest prediction, then, might be this: progress stalls when we mistake cultural difference for inferiority. So as we look back at his 20 uncannily accurate forecasts, the question isn't just which one astonishes us most, it's what blind spots we might be clinging to today. Every era has its Marco Polos, those rare observers who see the seeds of tomorrow in the soil of the present. The real challenge lies in having the humility to listen, whether the voice comes from a 13th century merchant or a modern scientist in a lab halfway across the world. Because if history teaches us anything, it's that the future rarely arrives where it's expected, but it always favors those willing to look beyond their own horizons. Now it's your turn. Which of Polo's predictions makes you see the past or even the present differently? Drop your thoughts below and let's keep the conversation going. And if you've enjoyed this journey through history's hidden connections, don't forget to subscribe because the next revelation might be just around the corner.